The smell hit them first. Roasted beef, onions sizzling in butter, bread warm enough to steam the cool Texas air. The German prisoners stood frozen by the fence, their faces flushed not from the sun, but from disbelief. Beyond the gate, women in aprons waved them over, laughing softly as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Come on, supper's ready," one called, her accent light, her tone bright as church bells. The men hesitated. These were Cowboys' wives, Americans, wives of the very men who had captured them weeks ago. Now they were being invited to dinner? They looked at one another, cheeks reddening beneath stubble and dust, torn between pride and hunger. When they finally crossed the yard, boots dragging, the women handed them plates piled high with meat and potatoes. For a moment, the war fell silent. One prisoner whispered, "They're feeding us like friends." No one answered. No one could. The Texas sun burned low over the plains, bleaching the land into shades of amber and bone. Beyond the barbed wire, the horizon looked infinite, cruel in its freedom. Inside the camp, the German prisoners moved like shadows of themselves. Most were barely past 20, faces drawn thin, their eyes hollowed by surrender. Their once proud uniforms had been replaced with coarse khaki, their boots patched, their spirits threadbare. They worked in silence beneath the gaze of cowboys who had traded lassos for rifles. The guards' easy posture made the prisoners uneasy. Their calm was foreign, almost disarming. Among them was Ernst Bauer, a former mechanic from Hamburg whose hands had built engines for war and now shoveled dirt for survival. He had been raised to see surrender as dishonor, defeat as death. Yet here he was, alive and confused. He remembered the speeches that had filled his youth with fire, that Americans were savages, that capture meant humiliation, that death was cleaner. But the reality before him was wrong in every possible way. The guards spoke gently, their southern drawls low and measured. One even offered him a cigarette once, saying, "Smoke's a smoke even for you fellas." The words had stung more than they comforted. The camp itself defied imagination. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows, water pumps that actually worked, even a small shed where coffee simmered each morning. It was not luxury, but it was order, and that order felt like mockery. They were prisoners, yet somehow treated as men. Bauer could not decide which was worse, cruelty or kindness. As dusk fell, the air thickened with the smell of dust and grease. A truck appeared on the road, rattling like an old tin drum. The driver, one of the guards, jumped down and waved toward the fence. In the truck bed sat baskets wrapped in red and white cloth. The prisoners froze. Visitors. Out stepped women, cowboys' wives in cotton dresses, hair tied up against the wind. They carried pots and platters, their laughter rising like birds. Bauer felt the air tighten in his chest. They had been told American women spat on prisoners, yet here they were, smiling. When one woman called out, "Come on now, supper's ready," her voice broke through the wall of silence. The guards exchanged glances, then opened the gate. For a moment, no one moved. Bauer's stomach growled loudly enough for the man beside him to hear. Someone muttered, "A trap." But hunger overruled suspicion. Bauer stepped forward first, boots heavy in the red dirt. The others followed cautiously, as if crossing into enemy ground once more. On the other side, tables had been laid with care, rough wooden planks covered in clean linen, plates already waiting. One woman ladled stew into bowls, her movements brisk, unafraid. The smell of beef and onion filled the air. Bauer felt his throat tighten. When she handed him a plate, her hand brushed his. It was an ordinary touch, yet it burned through him. He muttered, Danke. She tilted her head, smiling as though she understood. They ate slowly, awkwardly. The stew was rich, heavy, foreign. A guard leaned against a fence post, rifle slung carelessly, saying, "Guess a man's got to eat, no matter the flag." Bauer chewed, eyes stinging, each bite dissolving something inside him. Around him, laughter bloomed cautiously. One of the Germans coughed on tea, another marveled at butter. No one mocked them. When the meal ended, the women gathered the plates. One said softly, "We'll see y'all next Sunday." The words struck Bauer like a bell. Back behind the wire, the night air felt different, gentler, almost alive. Lying in his bunk, he stared at the ceiling, hearing crickets sing beyond the fence. For the first time since his capture, he did not feel like a beast of war. He felt human, and that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. The memory of that first dinner clung to Bauer like a ghost, its scent of roasted beef and warm bread lingering long after the plates were cleared. He lay on his bunk beneath the thin Texas night, staring at the wooden ceiling as the crickets sang. Every flicker of sound seemed to blur into the past, the wind through the barracks merging with the wind that had howled through the ruins of Germany. He could still see it, the gray smoke above the Elbe, the last artillery shells fading into silence. His unit had been surrounded for days before they surrendered. When the Americans came through the haze, their rifles raised but their voices calm, Bauer had expected execution. Instead, one offered him water. That act, so ordinary and absurd, had shaken him more deeply than fear ever could. Now, seated at a dinner table in Texas, the confusion returned with full force. He remembered what the officers had said, that capture was shame, that Americans were brutes who mocked prisoners, that the Allied camps were places of starvation and cruelty. But here, under a roof that smelled faintly of cedar and soap, the enemy's wives were serving him stew. He felt as if the world had lost its gravity. The women's laughter drifted across the table like a foreign melody. None of it made sense. Every gesture of kindness pressed against the propaganda that had once been carved into his bones. He tried to summon anger, to remind himself of the burning cities, of the corpses buried in rubble, of his mother's letters that had stopped coming when the bombers reached Hamburg. But the fury refused to return. It slipped away each time a woman's voice broke the silence with a question or a smile. The sound of the clock ticking inside the house struck him hardest. Its steady rhythm belonged to a world that had not collapsed, a world that still trusted time to behave. Across the table, Hoffman, one of the older prisoners, lifted his cup and said quietly that the tea tasted like his childhood. No one answered. They were all too busy wrestling their own ghosts. The women moved among them, pouring refills, their aprons dusted with flour. One brushed Bauer's shoulder in passing, and the contact jolted through him like a spark. He froze, ashamed of the warmth it left behind. The enemy was not supposed to be gentle, yet here gentleness was the only law. Outside, the evening deepened into violet. Through the open window drifted the sounds of a life untouched by war. The groan of a screen door, the low whinny of a horse, a radio playing a song about home. Bauer tried not to listen, but the tune slipped into him, stirring something long buried. He had forgotten that peace had a texture, a rhythm that did not require orders or fear. For years his heart had marched to the drumbeat of command. Now, for the first time, it stumbled to silence. When the meal ended, the men rose awkwardly, unsure whether to salute or bow. The women only smiled, collecting plates, speaking softly as though afraid to break the spell. One said, "Come again next Sunday," as naturally as if they were neighbors, not enemies. The words followed Bauer all the way back to the gate. He walked slowly, his boots scuffing the red dirt. His mind splintered between two worlds, the one he had been trained to die for, and this strange, merciful one that refused to hate him. That night, lying awake, he listened for the ticking of the clock beyond the fence. Its steady beat carried across the quiet plains like a reminder that somewhere life continued unbroken. Bauer closed his eyes, but the rhythm would not leave him. It was the sound of a world that had not surrendered, and of a man beginning to question everything he had ever believed. The next morning broke bright and dry, the kind of Texas day that seemed carved from sunlight. The prisoners marched out toward the pastures, shovels slung over their shoulders, their boots crunching on gravel that shimmered with heat. The land rolled outward in all directions, an ocean of grass and dust stitched together by barbed wire and the occasional oak tree. It felt endless, almost mocking. Bauer squinted against the glare, sweat already crawling down his neck, his thoughts still tangled from the night before. The memory of the dinner clung to him like the smell of smoke in fabric. He had eaten with Americans, laughed even, and now he was expected to return to work as if nothing had shifted inside him. But everything had. The Cowboys were already there, leaning against fence posts with the easy balance of men who belonged to the land. They wore wide-brimmed hats and shirts rolled at the sleeves, their rifles slung not as threats, but as afterthoughts. One of them, Sam, nodded as the Germans approached. "Morning, boys," he drawled, and Bauer felt the word boys settle strangely in the air. No one in the Wehrmacht would have dared speak to a prisoner so casually, let alone greet him. The guards' formality had been a kind of armor. These men's informality was something else entirely, disarming in its simplicity, unsettling in its ease. The work began with mending fences and clearing brush. The Germans, disciplined by habit, moved in lines, their motions sharp and deliberate. The Cowboys, however, worked with a loose rhythm that seemed closer to music than command. "No rush," one of them called when Bauer's group began digging too quickly. "Ground's not going anywhere." The prisoners exchanged bewildered glances. No rush? The very idea was foreign. They had been trained to move as though every breath were borrowed. Here, the pace of life seemed dictated not by orders, but by the sun's slow climb across the sky. As the day stretched on, the tension began to thin. When the Cowboys broke for water, they passed canteens without ceremony. One offered Bauer a cigarette. Bauer hesitated, but the man simply shrugged and lit one for himself, the smell of tobacco curling between them. After a moment, Bauer accepted. They smoked in silence, watching vultures circle high above the mesquite trees. "Hell of a day," the cowboy muttered. Bauer nodded, though he barely understood. Yet the gesture, a shared pause in the shade, felt more fluent than any language. Laughter began to appear in small, nervous bursts. Hoffman, the older prisoner, tried to mimic a cowboy's gait, his shoulders loose, his arms swinging too wide. The Texans howled good-naturedly, and one of them handed him a hat that slipped down over his ears. For a brief second, even Bauer smiled. The sound startled him. He had forgotten how laughter felt, how it loosened the chest, how it made the world feel a little less sharp. But confusion followed quickly behind the warmth. Why were these men, who had lost brothers and friends in a war against Germany, laughing with them now? Bauer tried to remind himself of his place, enemy, captive, defeated, but the boundaries kept dissolving. When one of the Cowboys clapped him on the shoulder after a day's work and said, "You handle a shovel better than most fellas I hire," Bauer didn't know how to respond. No one in his own army had ever spoken to him like that. Respect was something earned through obedience, not humanity. As the sun dropped lower, painting the horizon in copper, the men gathered by the fence for a final count. Dust clung to their boots, sweat streaked their faces, and for the first time since capture, Bauer realized they all looked the same. Cowboys and prisoners alike, indistinguishable in grime and fatigue. When Sam tipped his hat and said, "See y'all tomorrow," Bauer caught himself nodding back as if he were part of the crew. That night, lying on his bunk, the day replayed in fragments, the borrowed cigarette, the laughter, the casual greetings. None of it fit the world he had known. Discipline had once been his compass. Now he was navigating something far more treacherous, kindness without motive, labor without punishment, equality without rank. It was disorienting, dangerous even. And yet, when he closed his eyes, Bauer could still smell tobacco and sun-warmed earth, and for the first time, the scent didn't remind him of war. It reminded him of life. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills, staining the Texas plains in shades of copper and rose. The air carried the scent of cut hay and something sweeter, baking bread. Bauer sat outside the barracks, his hands still rough with splinters from fence work. Around him the men were quiet, their laughter from the fields replaced by a silence that felt expectant. Then the rumble of engines echoed from the road. 2 trucks appeared through the dust, each loaded with baskets wrapped in checkered cloth. The same ranchers' wives from before climbed down, their dresses fluttering in the warm wind. They waved as if greeting old friends. "Evening, boys," one called. The guards opened the gate. The prisoners hesitated. None wanted to be first, but hunger and curiosity pushed them forward. Beneath a broad oak tree, tables were already set, rough planks draped in linen, lanterns hanging above them like captured stars. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables drifted through the air. Bauer felt his stomach clench. These women, wives of the men who had captured them, were feeding them again. It defied logic, yet the evidence stood steaming before them. They ate in uneasy silence. Every scrape of a fork sounded too loud, every breath too heavy. Bauer sat across from a boy named Dieter, barely 19, whose hands shook as he lifted his glass of milk. One of the women, a small freckled lady with kind eyes, smiled at him. "You've earned it," she said softly. The boy blushed so deeply his ears turned pink. He muttered, "Danke," and she seemed to understand. Bauer looked away, pretending not to notice the ache rising in his chest. The domestic warmth unsettled them. War had stripped the world of softness, replaced it with the clatter of boots and orders. Here the rhythm was gentle, the rustle of dresses, the hum of crickets, the clink of dishes being cleared. For men who had lived by command, this kind of peace felt dangerous. Bauer couldn't decide if it was mercy or humiliation. Yet when one woman passed him a slice of pie, her hands dusted with flour, he felt something crack within him. She had baked for him, a German prisoner. He had no defense against that. As the meal continued, tension loosened. A cowboy near the fence played a harmonica, the tune slow and wistful. A few prisoners began tapping their feet in rhythm, and soon cautious laughter rippled through the tables. Even Bauer smiled once, though the gesture startled him. For the first time in years, he was part of something that felt human. The women noticed, and their smiles deepened, not pitying, just kind. When the plates were cleared, one thanked Dieter for helping carry firewood earlier. The boy froze, unsure how to respond, then stammered, "It was nothing." His cheeks burned. None of them were used to gratitude. It was a luxury lost in the rubble of Europe. That simple acknowledgment left him trembling. As the prisoners were escorted back to the barracks, the women called after them, "Y'all take care now." Their voices lingered in the air like perfume. Bauer turned once to look at the tables glowing beneath the lanterns, the linen stirring gently in the wind. It looked almost like a memory from another life. That night, lying awake, Bauer realized what frightened him most. Not the captivity, not the work, not even the war he had lost, but the feeling that, in this strange place, kindness was undoing everything he once believed about enemies and about himself. Days passed before the guards brought the news they would be allowed to write letters home. The announcement fell like a stone into still water, silent at first, then rippling through the camp with disbelief. Bauer stood among the men, heart pounding, as the sergeant explained the rules, one page, written neatly, in English or German, inspected before it left the country. No mention of troop movements, no politics, no descriptions of camp life beyond general well-being. It was mercy, the man said, but even mercy carried its boundaries. That night, each prisoner was given a single sheet of paper and a pencil dull from use. The barracks filled with the scratch of hesitant handwriting, as if the act itself were something they had forgotten how to do. Bauer stared at the blank page for nearly an hour before writing the first word, "Mutter." His hand trembled. How could he tell her that he was alive, that he was safe, that he was being fed better than she likely was in Hamburg? He pictured her standing in the ruins of their street, coat buttoned against a cold that had nothing to do with weather, searching for bread that no longer existed. To admit his comfort felt like betrayal. To lie felt worse. He wrote slowly, his pencil dragging like a confession. "I am healthy. I am treated fairly. The people here are kind." The words looked strange on the page, like a foreign language. Around him, the other men were silent, their faces bent over paper as though they were praying. Hoffman whispered under his breath, mouthing each line before writing it down. Dieter chewed his lip raw, erasing again and again. The letters were short, half-statements, clipped thoughts. But between the lines lay something rawer than honesty. Shame. They were alive while others starved. They slept in beds while their families hid in basements. The dissonance between their suffering and their survival was a weight none could name. The next morning the guards collected the envelopes. Some men hesitated to hand them over, clutching their letters like lifelines. "They'll read them anyway," Hoffman muttered. "They'll cut out what hurts the most." But even censored, the words mattered. For men who had been stripped of identity, writing their names on an envelope was an act of reclamation. It said, "I still exist." That night, the guilt came heavier than hunger. Bauer lay awake listening to the wind, thinking of the meal they had eaten that evening, stew thick with meat, bread spread with butter, slices of pie that made the younger ones close their eyes with pleasure. He thought of his mother's hands, cracked and red from scrubbing laundry, of the ration lines that twisted through the bombed streets. His stomach churned, not from food, but from the realization that the enemy fed him better than his own country ever had. The cruelty of it was almost mathematical. The Reich had promised glory and delivered ruin. America, the supposed monster, had given him warmth. He wanted to hate them for it. He wanted to call it manipulation or vanity, anything but compassion. Yet when one of the guards passed by that night, humming an old hymn, Bauer felt the strange calm of recognition. The enemy's kindness had become the heaviest burden of all. A week later, the camp received the first replies, thin envelopes, fragile as moth wings. Some men wept when they saw their names. Bauer's letter from home came in his sister's hand. She wrote of empty shelves, of nights spent in the cellar, of children too tired to cry. "We are proud you live," she ended, "but do not forget us." The words pierced him clean through. He folded the letter once, then again, until it fit in his palm like a wound he could not close. That night he burned his extra bread ration in the stove, watching the crust blacken in the flames. It was not repentance. It was the only kind of prayer he still remembered. The next morning, the wind carried the scent of rain across the plains. A promise, not yet fulfilled. Bauer stood behind the barracks, staring at the patch of bare dirt that stretched between the laundry shed and the fence. It was a place no one noticed, a strip of ground too small for drills, too poor for grass. A cowboy named Sam was repairing a water trough nearby, humming softly to himself. When he finished, he walked over, dusting his hands on his jeans. "You ever plant anything?" he asked casually, as if the question required no context. Bauer blinked, uncertain whether it was a joke. Sam held out his palm. Inside were a few small seeds, tomato, maybe, or beans, wrinkled, ordinary, and yet impossibly alive. "Figure this dirt could use some purpose," Sam said, nodding toward the empty space. "Man can't live off fences alone." Bauer hesitated, then reached out. The seeds felt weightless, almost mocking in their fragility. He had built machines that could tear cities apart, and now he held the makings of life between his fingers. "You want me to plant them?" he asked. Sam shrugged. "Ain't for me to want. Might do you some good." And with that, the cowboy walked away, leaving Bauer alone with the seeds and the soft waiting earth. He crouched, digging shallow trenches with his hands. The soil was dry, stubborn, filled with stones. It resisted him, much like his own mind did. But he worked patiently, pressing each seed into the dirt, covering them with care he didn't understand. The act was almost reverent. Around him, other prisoners paused to watch. Hoffman muttered that it was foolish, that nothing could grow in this heat. Bauer said nothing. He simply kept working until his hands were black with soil. When he finished, he sat back and stared at the patch of disturbed ground, his breath coming slow. It was the smallest thing he had ever done, and perhaps the most significant. Days turned into weeks. Bauer tended the soil between work details, bringing scraps of water from the trough, shielding the spot from the wind with boards. Sometimes Sam joined him, offering quiet advice about spacing and shade. "Give it time," the cowboy said once, squinting at the barren earth. "Ain't much in this world grows fast except trouble." Bauer had smiled at that, a small, reluctant smile that felt foreign on his face. When the first green shoots broke through the dirt, the prisoners gathered around as if witnessing a miracle. Hoffman touched one leaf, fragile as glass. "It lives," he whispered. Bauer nodded, though he didn't trust his voice. The tiny plants became the camp's quiet obsession. Even the guards began to stop by, leaning on their rifles to watch. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone seemed to understand what the garden meant. It was proof that life could still push through even the hardest ground. As the plants grew, so too did something else, an invisible thread of trust between the captives and their captors. The cowboys began saving kitchen scraps for compost, slipping them to Bauer when the officers weren't looking. The prisoners, in turn, shared what little they had: a carved wooden spoon, a hand-stitched patch for a torn sleeve. The exchanges were small, wordless, but they carried weight. War had taught them to destroy. The garden taught them to tend. By summer, the patch behind the barracks had transformed. Rows of green swayed in the wind, speckled with small yellow blossoms. Bauer knelt beside them one evening, brushing his hand over the leaves. The air smelled of sun and earth, of something clean and new. When Sam walked up, hands on his hips, he grinned. "Told you it'd grow," he said. Bauer looked up, the setting sun catching in his eyes. "I didn't think it would," he admitted. "Guess dirt's more forgiving than men." Sam shook his head. "Maybe it's men who need to learn from dirt." That night, Bauer wrote in his diary. A habit returned after months of silence. "We used to sow death and call it duty. Today I sowed life and felt free." He closed the notebook gently. The crickets sang outside, and somewhere beyond the fence a coyote howled. For the first time since the war began, the sound didn't frighten him. It reminded him that life, like those small green shoots, had a way of finding its way back to the light. By midsummer, the garden behind the barracks was a small miracle, a patch of green thriving in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. The vines hung heavy with tomatoes, the soil rich with life, and every leaf seemed to whisper proof that something within them had begun to heal. It was then that the invitation came again. Another Sunday dinner at the ranch house. The prisoners, sunburned and lean, but no longer gaunt, filed through the gate under a sky streaked with gold. Bauer walked among them, his hands still stained faintly with earth. The table was longer this time, set beneath the same oak tree where lanterns swayed gently in the breeze. The rancher and his wife greeted them with quiet smiles. "You've worked hard," the man said simply, motioning for them to sit. The smell of roasted beef, potatoes, and cornbread wrapped around the evening like a benediction. No guards hovered nearby anymore, only the unspoken trust that months of shared labor had built. At first, they ate in silence. Forks scraped softly against plates. The women spoke in low voices, passing dishes, laughing occasionally, as if to remind the men that laughter was still permitted in the world. Bauer chewed slowly, his chest tight with a kind of gratitude that bordered on shame. He had learned to accept kindness in pieces, a smile, a cigarette, a seed, but a full table, a meal shared as equals, still unsettled him. Across from him sat a young prisoner named Kruger, barely older than a boy, his face reddened by sun and embarrassment. His hands fumbled with the cutlery, unused to the ceremony of comfort. When one of the rancher's daughters poured him more gravy and said, "You eat too little," he blushed so fiercely the others grinned. But beneath their amusement there was ache, an awareness that they were being treated better here, in captivity, than they had ever been by their own officers. The realization hung in the air like a weight until, suddenly, someone spoke it aloud. Hoffman, the eldest among them, put down his fork, his voice rough. "You treat us better than our own officers ever did." The words stopped everything, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, even the cicadas seemed to hush. The rancher looked up slowly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he nodded once. "War's over, son," he said quietly. "Your people again." Something broke in the silence that followed. Bauer felt it ripple through the table like a tremor. Relief, grief, maybe both. Hoffman's eyes glistened, and he muttered an apology, but the rancher only waved him off. "Ain't nothing to be sorry for," he said. "World's got enough hate without us adding to it." The men lowered their heads, unsure how to bear such mercy. Gratitude felt too small a word for what pressed inside them. When the meal ended, no one wanted to leave. The air was thick with unspoken things. Memories of orders followed, of loyalty betrayed, of the long road that had led them here. The rancher poured coffee for them himself, his hands steady, his eyes tired but kind. "You boys worked hard," he said. "That's worth respect. Don't matter which flag you carried." Bauer met his gaze and felt something inside him shift, an understanding that defeat was not humiliation, but a kind of release. As darkness fell, the prisoners rose, hats in hand, their voices thick with quiet thanks. The women waved them off as the first crickets began to sing. Walking back toward the camp, Bauer felt lighter and heavier all at once. The barbed wire no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a line drawn between who he had been and who he might still become. That night, lying awake, he thought of the rancher's words echoing in his mind. "Your people again." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something rarer, a reminder that humanity, once lost, could still be found at a dinner table beneath an open Texas sky. A few evenings later, the air turned cooler, soft with the scent of rain-soaked cedar. The prisoners had finished their chores early, and the guards, now more companions than captors, allowed them to linger by the fence as twilight deepened. From the ranch house porch came a sound that made everyone pause, a piano. The melody drifted across the fields, slow and tender, like a memory too delicate to touch. It was a hymn, though softer than any church version Bauer remembered, played with a gentleness that seemed to reach beyond language. The cowboy's wife sat at the piano, her hands moving with unhurried grace. The men stood still, unsure whether to listen or retreat. Then, almost without realizing it, Bauer began to hum. It was faint at first, a reflex more than choice, a German folk tune buried deep in his childhood, one his mother had sung over laundry lines and stew pots. The melody twined itself into hers, the two sounds meeting in the space between the fence and the porch. The woman looked up, her fingers faltering for just a moment before she caught the rhythm again. Then she smiled, not at him, but into the music itself, and kept playing. The guards didn't stop him. One of them even leaned against the porch railing, tapping a boot in quiet time. Hoffman joined in next, his voice rough, deep, carrying years of smoke and sorrow. Soon several of the prisoners were humming softly, their tones uneven but sincere. The piano swelled, and for a moment the war dissolved. No fences, no uniforms, just sound and the pulse of something older than hate. It was as if the land itself had exhaled. When the song ended, no one clapped, no one spoke. The silence that followed was its own kind of reverence. Bauer lowered his head, his throat tight. He felt both lighter and lonelier than he ever had. The woman rose from the piano and disappeared inside, returning moments later with a guitar. "You boys know this one?" she asked. Her husband chuckled. "Darlin', they barely know English." But when she strummed the first notes, slow, rhythmic, the kind that traveled more through the heart than the ear, Bauer found himself swaying, understanding not the words, but the ache behind them. Music, he realized, needed no translation. It didn't ask for allegiance or apology. It simply reached across whatever walls men built. The sound drew out memories he had long buried, his mother's hands rinsing linen, his father's boots scraping against the wooden floor, the smell of smoke from their small stove. Home. Not the Germany of propaganda or parades, but the home made of small human things that had nothing to do with empire or ideology. As the last chords faded, one of the cowboys offered the guitar to Bauer. "You play?" he asked. Bauer shook his head, smiling faintly. "No," he said, "but I remember." The man nodded as if that were enough. Perhaps it was. That night, back in the barracks, the men spoke in whispers about the music. Dieter said it had made him homesick. Hoffman said it had made him proud. And Bauer said nothing at all. He sat by the small window, staring out at the faint glow from the ranch house where the piano still rested, silent now. The music had left an imprint in the air, in the soil, in him. It had bridged a distance no speech could cross. He thought then of something the rancher had said days before. "Your people again." Bauer understood it now, not as mercy, but as truth. The music had proven it, even after the world had torn itself apart. A melody could still mend what was left. By the time the orders came, the air had grown heavy with the scent of ripening fields. The harvest shimmered gold in the Texas heat, and the garden behind the barracks stood full and alive, tomatoes gleaming like small suns, beans climbing the fence in thick green curls. It was there that Bauer stood when the announcement reached them. They were going home. The word felt strange in his mouth, as if it belonged to someone else. Around him, men cheered or wept, but he only stared at the soil. Home. He could hardly picture what that meant anymore. The day of departure came quietly, without ceremony. The trucks rumbled into camp before dawn, headlights cutting pale beams through the dust. The prisoners lined up, their belongings packed into makeshift bundles, a spare shirt, a carved spoon, a folded letter. Some carried small tokens given by the ranchers' families, a handkerchief embroidered with initials, a photograph taken beside the garden, a recipe for cornbread written in a woman's careful script. These were not souvenirs. They were pieces of a world they hadn't known could exist. As they boarded the trucks, the rancher and his wife stood by the gate. The men removed their caps, heads bowed. No speeches were given, no promises made. Only eyes met, full of gratitude, too deep for words. "Safe travels," the rancher said softly, his drawl catching in his throat. "The world's big enough for peace, if folks let it be." One of the women pressed a small package into Bauer's hand. Inside, later, he would find a bar of soap wrapped in paper and tied with twine, the same kind they'd been given their first day in camp. A reminder, perhaps, that cleansing takes more than water. The trucks carried them to the rail yard, where long gray trains waited like tired beasts. Bauer climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window. The whistle blew, and the land began to slide away. The fences, the oak tree, the porch where music had once filled the night. The prisoners watched in silence, each man locked within his own storm of memory. The further the train went, the more unreal it all seemed. The laughter, the food, the warmth. America faded into distance, yet it clung to them in ways no barbed wire ever had. Days stretched into weeks as the ship carried them across the Atlantic. The sea was restless, a vast gray mirror that reflected nothing but uncertainty. Bauer lay awake at night, hearing the groan of the hull and the whisper of waves. He tried to imagine Germany, the streets of Hamburg, the church spires blackened by fire, his mother's face lined by hunger. Would she recognize him now? Would she understand what he had learned? That the enemy's kindness could wound deeper than cruelty ever did? When they finally reached Europe, the air smelled of ashes. Germany was not a country anymore. It was a graveyard that still breathed. The train tracks cut through ruins where once there had been towns. Children watched from crumbling platforms, their eyes hollow, their ribs sharp beneath thin shirts. The men in the carriage fell silent, each afraid to look too long. For all the months they had spent dreaming of home, the sight of it filled them with dread. Bauer carried his bundle through the ruins of his city, the small bar of soap still wrapped and unbroken in his pack. He passed walls covered in soot, streets where the stones had melted from fire, and thought of Texas, the smell of bread, the hum of the piano, the rustle of the garden in the wind, each memory a wound, and yet a gift. The world he had been told to hate had shown him what it meant to be human. That truth followed him like a ghost. He reached what was left of his mother's house, its windows gone, its roof collapsed. In the rubble, he set the soap on a cracked windowsill, its faint scent of lavender rising in the still air. It was all he had to offer, a token of the strangers who had treated him as a man when his own nation had forgotten how. As evening fell, he looked toward the horizon, imagining the vast plains half a world away. The war was over, they said. Yet Bauer knew some battles never ended. Some lived quietly inside you, in the space between memory and mercy, where kindness became both scar and salvation. Years passed. The war that had once swallowed the world drifted into the pages of history books. But for those who had lived it, the echoes never fully dimmed. Bauer grew old, his hands thick with the lines of labor and time. He built a modest life in the new Germany, a mechanic once more, husband, father, but the memories of Texas followed him like a shadow that never aged. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was still and the radio hummed softly from the parlor, he would take out the old tin box where he kept the few relics of captivity. A faded photograph of the rancher's family, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a woman's initials, and the small bar of lavender soap, still wrapped in paper gone soft with years. One winter evening, long after his hair had turned white, Bauer sat at his desk and began to write a letter to his son, who was studying history at the university. The boy had asked once, curious and careful, what it was really like to be a prisoner. Bauer had not answered then. Now, with the weight of decades pressing on him, he found the words. His handwriting trembled as he began. They fed us like family, and for a moment I forgot I was the enemy. The sentence hung on the page, simple, unadorned, but it carried a lifetime within it. Bauer described that dinner beneath the oak tree, the smell of bread, the soft laughter, the rancher's quiet voice saying, "Your people again." He wrote about the garden, the music, the way sunlight fell across the barbed wire like forgiveness made visible. He told his son that captivity had not broken him. It had remade him. "I learned," he wrote, "that decency can defeat ideology more thoroughly than any army. They conquered us with kindness, and we never recovered." Outside, snow pressed against the windows, muffling the world in silence. Bauer paused, remembering faces blurred by time. Hoffman's gruff humor, young Dieter's shy smile, the cowboy named Sam who taught him how to plant seeds in barren ground. He wondered if they, too, remembered those evenings in Texas, or if the years had washed it away. For him, it had never left. The memory had rooted itself deep, growing like the vines behind the barracks, persistent and alive. He finished the letter slowly, each word an act of reconciliation with the past. "War teaches men how to hate," he wrote, "but peace teaches them how to endure it. I used to think forgiveness was surrender. Now I think it is survival." When he sealed the envelope, his hands lingered on it for a moment longer than necessary, as if reluctant to let go. Later that night, he stepped outside into the crisp air. The stars glittered over the snow-covered roofs, vast and unjudging. He thought of Texas, the heat, the dust, the music floating from the porch. He thought of that meal and how it had changed him more than the war itself. He realized then that memory was not a wound to be healed, but a lantern to be carried. Faint, flickering, but enough to light the path ahead. As the wind sighed through the alley, he whispered to the night, almost in prayer, "Thank you." It was meant for the ones who would never hear it. The rancher, his wife, the nameless kindness that had once reached across an ocean and undone his hatred. And if you've followed this story to the end, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to know your corner of the world. If this story moved you, Tap the like button, then subscribe just below this video and click the notification bell. That way, we can keep bringing forgotten human stories like this back to life, one act of kindness at a time.